Ah, great, wonderful. They had the good sense not to give me my own control of the mic. Sarah, were you going to say a few words before I introduce the session?
I can from here, if you like.
Yeah, I just didn't want to take your role.
I'll come back then.
Yeah, come down.
A bit impromptu, that's
Oh, no, sorry, you don't need to.
No, it's fine. No, let's do it together.
Very good.
Double act. Warm welcome, everybody, to the RSE and to the RSE's Curious Festival, which is knowledge made useful, brought to life, and that's the mission of the RSE. So the festival runs for a couple of weeks, and there's lots of these events. Obviously, this is the best one today, so you've hit the jackpot, and I'll hand back to you to cover it. But yes, a really warm welcome, and this is going to be absolutely fabulous. So back to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome, as Sarah says, to this event. My name's Nasamir, and I'm a professor of social and political science at the University of Glasgow, a role which is only 2.5 weeks old to me, so I'm still getting used to it. And it's my great pleasure to chair this discussion. And before I introduce you to our panelists, our great speakers, I just might say that it's a really exciting and important time to be thinking and talking about diasporas. It really feels like the world is on the move, and yet simultaneously looking for a home. And in many respects, our panel will speak precisely to that in a way in which recognises how, on the one hand, it's ever been thus. Some of you might know that diaspora is an ancient word, broadly meaning scattering, and that it's come to describe one way that people and communities try to hold and retain a certain kind of social and cultural connection across time and space. It's typically associated with migration, including displacement, and the idea of diaspora is often also linked to a notion of a homeland, as well as other times being used to describe an experience, a sense of in-betweenness that people relate to. Which diasporas are seen and which diasporas go unnoticed are, of course, key, and this is something that our panel this afternoon will discuss, not least to try and understand how some diasporas are more visibly contested when it comes to imagining shared membership, national identity, citizenship, and other ways in which what the normal way of belonging to a place might be. So we're fortunate in this respect to have three wonderful speakers. Our first speaker, Dr. Marlo Delara, is a Race-Ed Stuart Hall Foundation Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. She's an artist whose practice works across performance, visual distraction and film. Her research relates to feminism and the representation of marginalised populations, and she thinks in sound as well as visual form. Our second speaker will be Dr. Emma Hill, who is a Race-Ed archival fellow at the University of Edinburgh. She's previously held fellowships at the University of St Andrews and the University of Edinburgh. She is an interdisciplinary scholar, and she works on migration, post-colonial settlement, and the entanglements between identity and borders. And our third speaker is Dr. Katusha Bento, a lecturer in race and decolonial studies at the University of Edinburgh and co-director of the Race-Ed network. Her research focuses on black movements in Brazil, and she has a deep and profound belief and contribution to understanding how education can be transformative for social change. This session is partly curated by the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, not least by Ben Fletcher, who is also sat in the front row, so thank you to him. And I have been told to make sure that whatever else I do, I need to tell you where the fire exits are. And I have a slide on this, which is to say that there is no fire drill expected, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow the curious staff in their purple t-shirts, if you haven't seen them already, and they'll guide you out of the building safely to an assembly point on George Street. And so without any further ado, please let me introduce you to our panel, who will take their seats and talk through their topics, after which we'll have some Q&A and try to get a conversation going. Thank you. Marla, do you want to come first?
Yeah, sure.
and good afternoon. Thank you for the framing, Nassar, and also thank you for the lovely invitation. So it's interesting. When I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking how long I've been studying this word diaspora, which I'm going to use the American pronunciation there, as that's what leaves my lips quite easily. And the word itself only came into my vocabulary in postgraduate studies. I knew two things. My parents used the phrase back home, and that my cousins often referred to me as stateside. And with what felt like an excessive glowing pride whenever we visited my family compound in Davao. They would seat me in front of the full blast air conditioning, and it was terribly uncomfortable and terribly cold. And my parents would explain, this is just the way it is back home. It seemed too superficial for my kid brain, and I pledged a lifetime to understanding that tension. How do my multiple homes of both the Philippines and the USA, and now Scotland, inform or locate me differently from my peers? This sentiment is quite common in Filipinx American studies, this feeling of being a misfit. But perhaps we should start with the basics. For those of you who are less familiar, the Philippines is in Southeast Asia. In the Western Pacific Ocean, it consists of approximately 7,600 islands. The population of the Philippines in 2020 was 110 million, and 11% of those individuals live abroad. The largest Filipino diaspora is in the United States with a whopping 3.4 million. And in the United Kingdom, the population is about 158,000. So Philippine history itself is shadowed by a repeated claiming of the islands by conquests that were rationalized as civilizing missions. The Philippines has provided labor and resources for several occupations, empires such as Spain, Japan, and America, and the pre-colonial Filipino indigenous culture, known as the Taos, fought off the Spanish colonizers for 50 years. The country was named Las Islas Filipinas after Philip II of Spain, and then was anglicized to the Philippines by the USA. The Philippines was the only Asian colony of Spain. And in 1946, the Philippines officially gained independence from America with a provision that the country would still assist in military operations. Saying that, the economic dependency of the Philippines continues to fix the country into a neo-colonial relationship with America. Filipinos have been scattered throughout the globe providing labor, from domestic workers and farmers to nurses and doctors. The country has boasted a robust economy based on OFWs, overseas Filipino workers, our main export. Public education was structured by the US and therefore understood as more translatable to other countries. Family back home are reliant on contributions from those abroad and remittance culture, which features prominently in daily life. Still deeply connected to the Philippines and sharing a mutual understanding of the homeland based on memories and shared values, the imagined homeland is also kept intact by Balik Bayan culture, balik meaning back, bayan country, means return to the country. Filipinos have created pathways to send goods and money home and maintain family contact. Migrant communities have persisted over generations due to self-segregation and exclusion, operating under the radar, so to speak, to survive. And this rings very true today in the ways the Philippines are often not considered East Asian enough to be included with vastly different migration challenges than others in the region, and our particular histories of colonization. In the USA, the term brown Asian has become increasingly popular to compare our lived experiences to groups more similar to us, such as the Latino American and African American populations. So the trauma of being part of the Phil-Am, or Filipino American, shortened to Phil-Am quite commonly, is about living with, or part of it is living with the specter of former colonizers and being a product of multiple violent conquests. And it's really useful in understanding globalization today. There is no singular Philippine identity back home. And thusly, our lived experiences throughout the globe reflect that diversity. Sure, in my experience, I had shared religious and community celebrations. I celebrate the visibility of Philippine celebrities like boxer Manny Pacquiao and Hamilton composer Lin-Manuel Miranda and R&B hip-hop award-winning artist Her, and the comedian Joe Coy. And it is exciting that beloved chain restaurants that serve as cultural hubs like Jollibee on Princess Street? Yeah, Princess Street can be found throughout the world, promoting a rendition of our indigenous food and cultural products, even if its ethnic origin was still obscured from write-ups about its excellent crispy chicken. Ultimately, the Philippine Diasporic Project is one with many lessons about the pursuit of freedom and reclamation. Scholar E. San Juan Jr. says the psychic dynamics of a shared national nostalgia creates community, but ultimately serves into a national, popular, emancipatory project. Hopefully I can flesh out a bit more in the Q&A, but at least this gives us a place to start.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, I have some slides, so if the technology goes wrong, I'm really sorry in advance. But hopefully, yeah, that's me. So, my name's Emma, as Nasa said, and I've worked for the past few years on the topic of Somali migration to Scotland. And in amongst that, I have worked with Somali groups who are living in Glasgow today. And then more recently, I've also worked on historic records and archives that maps Somali-Scottish migration from the 1900s onwards. So the Somali diaspora is vast, 2 million people, and it's kind of partly the result of a sustained displacement from the conflicts, drought, and famine from the 1980s onwards. And there's a particularly large population in the UK, up to 400,000, and that's centred in cities including London, Bristol, Cardiff, and Liverpool. And in these cities, the population is all pretty well established and also fairly long-lived. The result of the migration of Somali sailors who migrated here during the colonial era when northern Somalia was a British protectorate. And they migrated here as part of the merchant or military navy and began to form communities. One of the questions that I've been interested in answering is why, when places like Liverpool or Cardiff, with histories of colonial trading and colonial industry, why do they have histories of long-lived Somali diasporas, where somewhere like Glasgow, with similar colonial trading histories and colonial histories of colonial industry, why does Glasgow not have something similar? Why did similar diasporic settlements not arise here? And then the second part of the things that I'm interested here is why and what are the consequences for contemporary Somali populations in Scotland today? So these are all quite big questions for this presentation, and I'm going to kind of try and move fairly swiftly onto the topic at hand. And what I'm going to try and talk about is how this relates to the ways in which Scottish Somali people feature in public and political imaginaries, and how that kind of relates to the operation of colonial power today. So in Scotland today, there are up to 4,000 Somali people living here, and that makes Somali populations one of the largest black African populations in the country. The population is largely concentrated in Glasgow, although there are also some people living in Edinburgh. And it's been built over the last 2.5 decades, predominantly since the introduction of the dispersal scheme in 1999, which was a policy put in place by the new Labour government to forcibly disperse asylum-seeking people around the country. And at the time, Glasgow was the biggest kind of participant in terms of cities, and Somali people made up 1/3 of asylum applicants, so the two coincided. So it began with fairly traumatic beginnings, but over the last 2 decades, the population has persisted and settled. So, Somali people have been here a long time. They've been here in a way that has prompted deep-seated engagement and community work. So how do they feature in public and political imaginaries? So the short answer is, they don't. So this is from an interview with a young Somali woman who comments, "We're hidden down, we're under the table, we're not known, our faces are seen, but people don't know what we're about." And her observations are supported fairly well by comments in a 2014 article reporting on the then Community Secretary's Hamza Yusuf's comment on the Somali community, who he recognises as living in England, but as not having any existence in Scotland. So, representation number 1. Number 2, Somalis are perpetually seen as refugees. So you can see Abdul Rahman's comments on the right here. Somalis are still in that bracket, refugees. You can live here for a long time, but Somalis are not refugees anymore, they are citizens. And then the third imaginary, a highly racialized imaginary. So this is an article from the Daily Record commenting on criminal activities in the Gorbals area of Glasgow, which deploys some really racialized, racist tropes about the Somali subjects of the article. So what? So I'm going to leave that there. So these observations hint towards the complexities and violence of contemporary Somali post-migration experiences in Scotland. So things like of having to renegotiate a Somali identity and what that means in a Scottish setting, whilst also having to negotiate barriers to identity and belonging in the broader political and public context, of constantly having to highlight that you are here, of having to re-articulate yourself from the beginning, of having to narrativize yourself in terms of arrival or your migration status, rather than as a citizen or from where you are now. And having to do this in a context in which you are caught in racist imaginaries in a way that is casualized and everyday, but also structural and normative. So these 3 things and these observations begin to challenge that there's no racism problem here in Scotland myth, which has been talked about elsewhere. But what I wanted to highlight is it's not just about challenging this myth, it's also, I think that these tropes are not isolated incidents or coming from a position of ignorance or naivety, but rather are repetitions of representations and patterns that have occurred again and again. So, for instance, here, articles from the late 1980s, 1990s, you see the trope of Somali people being forgotten, being invisible, being refugees repeated. Here, in this picture of a human exhibition, you see similar racialized and racist representations of Somalis as savage, as primitive, that are repeated in this 2014 article from the Daily Record. And then here, in the experience of 2 Somali men 50 years apart, you see the culmination of those racist representations and racialized economies, where both men, Ahmed Sheikh and Ali Mohammed, were chased through Glaswegian and Edinburgh public spaces simply because they dared to be in them. Ahmed Sheikh with tragic consequences resulting in his racist murder. So here I think what you can see is how practices and imaginaries that were born out of the operation of colonial power during the colonial era, so here and here, are then reproduced in the post-colonial era of Somali-Scottish relations. And they've also reproduced their effects, and though they are not exactly the same, there are common threads that bind them together. So if I try and conclude. So I think what these things do is begin, as I said, to dispel myths of Scottish innocence, the whole no problem here, it wasn't us, all those kind of myths, which is also being done pretty well elsewhere. But I think more specifically, they begin to point towards the specificity of colonial power, that these aren't just generalized things, but they work in really particular ways with individual histories between particular countries, identities, and locations. And that the representational economies that you see are kind of reproduced, and so are their effects. And I think this may begin to explain some of the reason behind the absence of a larger or a longer-lived Somali population in Scotland. So, for instance, there was a Somali population in Edinburgh, kind of in the early 1990s, which fairly quickly dissipated after the murder of Ahmed Sheikh, that kind of representational violence translating into actual violence, translating into the dissipation of the communities. But I think also these things kind of maybe begin to challenge rhetoric around newness and this perpetual refugee status. So Somali-Scottish histories show that some Somali people were formerly colonial subjects, and this would sustain a degree of claims making on the colonial centre, on the colonial metropole in Scotland. And though this kind of claims making was dismantled during so-called decolonisation, it nevertheless bears traces of an acknowledgement by the British state of Somali claims to the colonial centre. And I think an awareness of a precedent of these claims kind of reframes the discussion. Somali people are not perpetually new or perpetually refugees, or even, dare I say it, new Scots, but are always, in Anne Korteweg's term, already integrated through a history of claims making and negotiation of colonial power in a way that discourses that focus on newness might otherwise obscure. That's me.
Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm Katusha. I work with the Black diaspora, and I am the daughter of the Black diaspora. And today I'm going to share a story, and then I'm going to explain this story. So bear with me if you don't understand, but I will ask you to help me in the telling of the story, considering that so many names were raised, and I'm going to ask you to repeat them with me as we go. It's just a few. I hope you don't feel overwhelmed. It's not that complicated. So since 2005, I've been part of Quilombo communities or working with them somehow, not as a researcher, but from the Black Brazilian movement in Brazil. And that's why my story will center these communities to discuss the Black Afro diaspora. So, can you repeat with me the word Quilombo? Quilombo. Yes, and I will talk about Quilombo dos Palmares. Quilombo dos Palmares. Yeah, it's in the northern region of Brazil. And this story starts in 1605, but you're going to see that this historical date is not quite accurate. But for this formal process of storytelling, we're starting in 1605. Over 60,000 people lived in this organized community called Quilombo dos Palmares, in small villages, with sophisticated irrigation security strategies and labor division that was not divided by gender, but interests, one's gifts. Dandara, repeat with me, Dandara, was one of the soldiers leading the security of the Quilombo. Of course, in the storytelling of Brazil, you're going to find many Dandaras with different roles, but for the sake of the story, Dandara is our warrior. They had tactics and support from the indigenous communities to hide and also learn the region. The people of the forest always helped the Quilombo people or so-called enslaved people trying to find the ways in the forest to run away from the masters, the enslavers, the colonizers. Zumbi, repeat with me, Zumbi was one of the leaders in Quilombo dos Palmares, alongside with Ganga Zumba. There are many names that we don't know. There are many people. We're talking about 60,000 people in a moment where Brazil was being colonized in a very violent way by Holland and Portugal, especially in this area. We're talking about Recife, where the beaches are amazing, you can imagine, but imagine the amount of resources there. But as much as they sent Napoleonic troops by Holland and Portugal to destroy Palmares, they were always victorious until 1965, when they used a horrendous captain who was famous to be a Quilombo killer, and they set everything on fire. They killed or captured everyone they could. Zumbi managed to escape for 3 days, and they hunted him down, and they killed him, but they not did just that. They put his head on a spike and put in the middle of the square in Recife, capital of Pernambuco, and that was 20 of November, 1695. So to remember, to say their names and other names that were erased from history, the Black Consciousness Day is celebrated every 20 of November, and it's a national holiday in Brazil. But the entire month of November is our Black History Month. Quilombos were formed in a way that precede this story that I'm telling you. They come way before all this ever happened, and will continue to be formed even to this day. Quilombo is not the meaning or the synonym of enslaved people who escaped. It holds a powerful meaning of a space of people who liberated themselves from colonial violence, a space that protects, reproduces, and leaves the faith, the knowledge, and culture of people from the African diaspora. For that reason, this story starts way before the Middle Passage and crosses generations, goes through our bodies, connecting the making of Quilombos in our praxis. I carry the Quilombo in me. And that's how Quilombos arrive in Scotland, through people from the Black diaspora. With the people of the African and Black diaspora making home with the tactics of refusal of the colonial violence. We refuse to forget our ancestors. We refuse to stop cooking our good-smelling food. We refuse to be seen as criminals. We refuse to the hostile environment. And we refuse to go back, because sometimes and now we are from here. And we continue refusing all the tactics of colonialism to make us or to place us as the other. The etymology of Quilombo comes with an Angolan meaning. It comes from Kimbundu language and the guerrilla strategies. The meaning of Quilombo is also translated in the Brazilian context in the struggles for freedom, land, and food sovereignty. To this day, Quilombos are being destroyed with Napoleonic troops. And even those kind of subtle gestures that keeps Quilombola people at the margin and raised and killed. But the praxis of quilombos is in our everyday. Not to be romantic, but as the melanated nuances that makes this experience to be in diaspora sometimes can be very dangerous, but full of life in the process of making home and making other quilombos. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. 3 wonderful expositions of different and contrasting meanings of the use of diaspora. We have more than 20 minutes for a discussion, and so whilst the audience gathers their thoughts and indicates that they might want to ask a question or make a comment, for which there'll be a roving mic, can I just start by noting that across each of the accounts that you presented, it's striking what role memory plays in terms of a strategic remembrance, but also a more kind of banal, diffuse reimagination of events in the past to narrate a collective identity. And it's one of the things about diaspora that is really very interesting, in that there isn't, an Archimedean point of an objective view about what a collective past is. There is a subjective encounter with a particular history that then is put to use, which may be an entirely accurate account, but it's the force and the use of that memory which is so contested in public life when it comes to challenging what prevails as normal and or pluralizing what prevails as normal. Is that a fair reading? Do you see that shared across your discussions, or is that too narrow an understanding of what it is you were trying to elaborate? Marlo?
I guess what's curious to me is, as far as, so there's 400 years of Philippine history that is not really documented in any fashion. Our libraries were burned. There's oftentimes a reclamation. Even my father found out that he was actually born a different year than he thought he was, because they erased those records when he migrated to the States. And we migrated to the States in the 60s. And he was born, well, he thought he was born in 1943. He was born in 1942.
And this is during decolonization, the Spanish destroyed the bureaucracies, right?
And also with the conversion of translating everything to American English standards, oftentimes the names get, all our names have, you hear the Latin name, last name, Marlo Dallara, Manny Pacquiao's different, but, like there's a, Rodriguez, there's always, you can hear the Spanish last name come out, but then our actual names oftentimes describe the water or describe the island that you're from. So what does memory mean if there's no actual document, right? And then if you are part of a movement that has kind of embodied the model minority myth to a certain extent, then there's a bit of pushback, because that we don't want that history. Don't tell us that history, like you'll hear from your elders, because they want to feel a sense of perseverance. But then there's also the reality of those situations as well. And so we're looking to heal ourselves as we try to remember together with accuracy, and also the valued act of deference to our elders and respecting that. So it's complicated.
Of course, a multi-layered, a multi-generational. Katusha?
I agree that the memory, as you said, that is crossing our imaginary of the past, or the collective imaginary of the past, makes sense. And when we talk about the Black Brazilian movement, we are talking about this sometimes even romantic understanding of Mother Africa as a united mother of Blackness and culture, that if you see there are some elements, if you watch the Carnival Parade, which is something that might be accessible and maybe more present in your imaginaries. We have elements of Africanness there in terms of the fabric or in terms of the faith, but that is like putting together some elements that you see present in Nigeria, some others in Kenya, some others in Sierra Leone, some others in South Africa, and this is the composition of that collective imaginary that was shattered in that middle passage. And how do we amend that? How do we repair that memory? So sometimes that's why we talk about, the Black diaspora and how that makes something else or a third space in which we are still negotiating and thinking. The Portuguese colony also used this strategy, but not only as a colony. At the time, it was in the First Republic, so Brazil was independent. But they used the colonial strategy to erase all the slave trade, because Portugal for some time almost had the monopoly of the slave trade. And in the archives in Brazil, they were intentionally burned. So how do you trace back? And that intentional shattering of our memories and our documents is still institutionalized, because you have people, just to trace this back to Europe, for example, we have Brazilians being able to claim the European citizenship, whether it is in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, or even in the UK, but because they have the documents, and especially that is the privilege of whiteness, right? That is Europeanness, that when people tell me, oh, I have a Brazilian friend, or the Brazilian friend has an European passport, I know they're white. Unless they married to someone, unless it's a different route. But this is quite complicated when you're talking about the Black diaspora, because we are not seen as citizens. And that citizenship was taken from us from that route of colonialism, but also how we're trying to amend that in making, for example, a religion like candomblé in Brazil is what we call the xirê. Xirê is a mixture of many orishas, which is the divine entities. Usually, originally in Brazil, in different areas in Africa, I'm talking about Ghana, what we know as Ghana nowadays, what we know as Nigeria, what we know as Angola, they had regions in which they would celebrate one determined orisha. But in the Middle Passage, they all came together, and now candomblé, as we know in Brazil, celebrates all these orishas, right? The ones from Angola, from all Yoruba, Igbo traditions. So that's the kind of a complicated way in which we're still navigating that reimagination of where we're coming from, what home is, what it can be, and what is actually becoming, which is a totally different thing. So I'm sorry to speak so much, but...
Emma, before we go to the audience.
Sure. That was great. Thank you so much. There's so much that I wanted to pick up on there, but I think what I wanted to try and pick up on from Nasser's and from both of your comments was this idea of the collective and a collective memory, because I think maybe what's coming through in all of our talks is the idea that a collective is maybe not possible, or maybe has been kind of indelibly fractured. And that's especially the case, I think, in the work that I'm doing, where if we're talking about memory and a kind of cohesive memory, we're talking about a false economy, because if we're talking about memory of home, of identity, of practices of violence from a Somali perspective, then we're not talking about a homogeneous identity. We're talking about kind of radical heterogeneity, and narratives and memories that have maybe been started but are then immediately fractured by the borders that have happened through colonialism, through displacement, and through different forms of violence. So whilst in Scotland, amongst Somali diaspora, there may be kind of common memories of migrating over a particular time, these memories are also, I guess, fractured and turn into kind of fractals of each other, where maybe somebody came from a different place, they had a different ethnicity, they had a different history of that place in a particular time. And none of that is homogenous. And I think we can say a similar thing in Scotland, where if we're thinking about memories and imaginaries of colonialism and relations between Scotland in a colonial sense and other places, then we're also thinking about borders. Like, what are we thinking about when we're talking about Scotland? Are we thinking about Scotland, the nation? Are we thinking about Scotland as part of the British state? How are we thinking about that interaction between Scotland and other places? And what does that mean for the idea of a collective memory? Is a collective memory possible?
Thank you so much. Great. So we have one question from the man in the third row. So the young man in the grey shirt in the third row, and then a question just at the end there.
A question for everybody, but just I'm thinking about what Emma said about how the perspective of the African diaspora in Scotland and the rhetoric against the African diaspora in Scotland hasn't really changed. I was out of the UK in East Africa and in Asia for 20 years and came back just 18 months ago. And standing at a bus stop in West Bilton, there were three either Afro-Caribbean or black African men standing. And a white lady came up and said, "This is like a whole effing other world now." That was her exact words. I challenged her right on the spot. But that whole rhetoric is being reinforced at the moment by mainstream media. Now, it's a slightly different subject, but it's very important. I happen to be a person of faith. I happen to be a person who tries to treat everybody exactly the same, no matter of their class, their race, whatever. I try to get in touch with the grassroots of everybody who's coming into the area in which I stay in. And so much has to come back down to education of people. It's an absolute disgrace. And I feel totally embarrassed as a Scotsman born and brought up in Edinburgh to hear all these racist remarks. So how do you begin to change the perspective of the African and Afro-Caribbean and Brazilian African diaspora in this time where whole society is being fractured?
Thank you very much. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much to all the panel. As a Brazilian myself, I will not be asking about Quilombola, not to embarrass myself, because I am clearly not. I'm very white, so I enjoy all my privilege for being from South Brazil. But what I want to say, first of all, to make a comment to what Katusha said, is that I have enjoyed the privilege of my whiteness in terms of having the European passport, yes. However, there is one key person in our family who has been erased, which is a black great-grandmother. We don't know anything about her. We know she was there because she's my grandmother's mom, but she has been completely erased from family history, from documentation, and from our environment. We don't know anything about her. So this is something that I think a lot. So I really appreciate what you said today, because the more I think about even our, in a small scale, different from what you said, our family histories as well, black people continue to be erased, even when one would consider themselves educated. So I'm not sure about the education what to do with education, given that I work in the School of Education at the University of Edinburgh. However, my question is to Marlo. You mentioned something very big that I took notes in very bold letters, a national, popular, emancipatory project. There is a lot going on there. Can you please, you mentioned that you could perhaps elaborate for us, so I would really appreciate, because what national are you talking about? Because I understand you were talking about citizens. So if you can please give us more details. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question as well, please, from the middle row.
Mia.
Please.
Hello? Cool. I just wanted to address two things. One thing into what two people mentioned, and that's the topic of education. And in my opinion, what comes down to that ultimately, so one of your questions was like, when we say education, what we're referring to, but I think typically in mainstream society, we reference education in a systemic way, as if that's the only principle of education that exists. And really, education, in my opinion, is intelligence. And I think intelligence is of your own agency. What inspires you to learn about, when you go down the road and you look at the castle or something, what inspires you to know more about that castle? And I think, when we're mentioning white supremacy as a systemic element in society, it needs to take its own agency, do you know what I mean, on education, and not assuming it's going to come from somewhere else. Do you get what I mean? You need to take, white supremacy or society needs to take its own control on what it wants to learn. Do you know what I mean? It's not for, I know we know this, but it's not for outside sources or any external sources to come to you within. Do you know what I mean? It needs to be like, okay, cool, how can we create a balanced dynamic? Like the same way, I think now in society we say, we have an understanding of like the patriarchy, so to speak. And in my opinion, I think that often takes a comfortable seat in conversation. Like say if we're sitting here in the room and we mentioned, there's something that I've noticed with racism or racial politics, it cuts a room or it creates tension in a room always. If we mention patriarchy or something in a room, it's like it's a given. It's like we can say, yeah, there's patriarchy and blah, blah, blah. Whenever you mention typically white supremacy in a room, any sort of room, it's like, ooh, eerie and whatever. But that same kind of thing where in society we're pressuring the patriarchy to go, well, learn, it's the male, we've got these terms and stuff like the male gaze, or you learn it. We need to do that same thing, do you know what I mean? And consider it not to take, to delve inward with this idea of guilt, white guilt, etc., etc. It's not about that. Do you know what I mean? It's about taking control of that, in my opinion. So yeah. I don't know if that's quite clear, what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So kind of common themes across those 3 points. A specific question about clarification, but I think that you can take them in the fashion in which you received them. Right?
Yeah, sure. So I will start by trying to address what your question about kind of how to challenge racism in Scotland when society is being fractured. And I think what I tried to do in my presentation there was really challenge this idea of newness. I think some of the power, as we just heard, some of the power of racism is that it's seen as a kind of controversial thing. As soon as somebody is accused of being racist, or like racism is institutional or otherwise is brought up in a room, there's this kind of collective. And I think one of the ways in which we begin to challenge that, introduce that into kind of common parlance, and for it to become a kind of normative topic of conversation, is emphasizing that these things are not new, by doing the archival work, by doing the historical work that shows that these things are not like a one-off aberration. They're not the actions of one individual on the street in Edinburgh. It's something that has happened time and time again through colonial systems, but also through other systems that have supported these things and enabled them to happen to the point that they haven't been challenged, to the point that they have become normative. And kind of, I guess, educating people and individuals that this is part of our history. It's not a one-off thing. It's something that is endemic and embedded in the ways things work.
Can we get an answer from them? And then, because I've got another few questions out there, and we've got 4 minutes, so I'm trying to make the most of our panel. Thank you. Go for it.
Thank you for all the comments and questions. I just wanted to address across the comments just things. One is that our families are also part of recognized institutions, right, in the state. So erasing someone's name in our very small circles may feel something very individual, but it's actually something institutional and structural in the society. And Hortense Spillers has a text called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And that addresses exactly how intentional it was to have Black families dismantled. You have children, they're gonna be sold to different people. We're not gonna unite people. So Journey Truth tried to reclaim some of her kids. She didn't manage to get them back, all of them back, and she saw them being sold. This is in the United States context. So I'm just trying to say that we need to say her name, say your great-grandmother's name. Bernadette Pacifico was killed just a few days ago. She's a mother, a spiritual mother in Candomblé, Salvador, Bahia. The same way her son was killed. I'm sorry for being talking about such triggering topics, but it was 12 shots on her face. It was an execution, specifically because she's a Quilombo person and she was fighting for the land of her Quilombo community. So this is me inviting you again so we don't forget that this is still happening. Her name was Bernadette Pacifico.
Thank you.
So, yeah, that's
Mark,
it.
did you have any thoughts on the comments that have been made? If you don't, it's fine, you can hold them.
I was actually just thinking a bit about specificity, you know, and how that level of clarity really helps with discussion. You know, if we're talking about, you know, the Somali diaspora, then we can talk about Blackness, and we can also very much land it within, say, this body of work addresses specifically the constellation of different factors that the Somali folks are encountering. And I think that's really important as long as we can read across, and that is very, very helpful. But reading absence of things as well as reading the presence of things is always really important as well. So it's kind of interesting because the question that you asked me actually kind of brings it all together to a certain extent. So Isan Juan Jr. is a scholar in the Philippines, but then he came to the States, and then he went back to the Philippines. And now he only writes in Tagalog, only writes in Filipino. And he was celebrated, and both very celebrated scholar. But one of the reasons why he was bringing this up is that the concept of the National Popular Emancipatory Project is there's a difference, as the last you mentioned about what education is, right? This difference between this kind of education, with the pretty bow, like the fancy lettering, right? And then education, like my mama told me this, right? Both have facets and are quite, and both are, we can use the words, call it data, right? Or we can call it feedback, or we can call it conversation, right? But that is that model of popular education versus formalized education. So when this is kind of a complicated thing. So when Isan Juan Jr. is saying, he also criticizes the concept of the nation and the nation state. So I think that might be a little bit of a translation issue that we actually have to go to Isan Juan Jr. to, because I read the American translation of this. I don't know the original lecture. Okay. So I think that's part of it there, is that it's really about the republic or the, you know, the islas, like the islas, the islands themselves, what they would call Philippines.
Thank you very much. Do you know what? I'm going to be really naughty and push the time to the max with 2 questions from the floor. If a trapdoor opens and I fall through it, that's why. Sorry.
Thank you very much indeed for the speakers. But it's with great sadness listening to some of your stories, because in actual fact there is healing that's required, great healing and education, and also to have all your memories lost, etc. I can only say, maybe you do not know about the Scottish diaspora tapestry, which was made by 1,105 people throughout the world. These tell the stories of Scots who emigrated to many, many countries. And I was very, very privileged for 2 years to go around the world, curating exhibitions for a month in each place. Perhaps it's time that perhaps your stories could be told.
Thank you very much. And just this gentleman in the third row. This man.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all that's happened so far. One of the things that strikes me from what's been said is that, and it hadn't really occurred to me before, but it seems to me that you can be a diaspora in your own country because of colonialism. That's just a comment. But alongside that, I'm from the Shetland Islands, and you probably don't know, but Shetland was colonised by the Scots. And even when I was growing up, the Scots were hated. And the Scots refused to let us use our own names. They refused to let us use our language. They refused to let us use our own religion. And in the 19th century, when that was still very much the case, there was a kind of reimagining of Shetland and Shetlanders, almost in exactly the same way Walter Scott did the reimagination of Scotland. But in that reimagining, how can you actually be true? How can you be true to the past and who you really are? Is there any way of doing that when so much has been destroyed?
So if you can answer some fundamental questions within the field of diaspora studies in a final minute or two.
I just wanted to say that we are already telling the stories. Yeah. We are already weaving them together, and we are here. Yes, our diasporas are within our countries. Our diasporas are also outside them, and even when we are nationals, we are diasporic. So yes, this is happening, and our voices are pretty much there in different tapestries, maybe different colors and different textures.
And you may be quite surprised at how accessible they are if one is, for example, just walking on Princess Street and understanding it may just be what is this new fried chicken place? It's delicious, right? But you might be like, why is it like this? Other people seem to know this, and there's lines, there were lines for weeks. And great, but let's unpack that. I mean, what are the different ways this shows up? When you go to the hospital, when you look at there's different people you engage with every day, and they're not, that perhaps there's that level, and there's also just in culture, saying who, this person, and they're talking about it. It's just whether or not legibility is very different than the absence of, right? Does it read? I think that's worth. Maybe we can read.
Emma, any final comments?
No, I think that's
Good. Legibility.
Could we do one last question from the online audience?
Oh yes, please do. Absolutely.
I just wanted to make sure we got another question in. So we had Sarah from online who asked what are the speakers' understandings of the term diaspora versus migrant communities, and what changes when we use those different terms?
Well, I think disciplinary-wise, when the term diaspora studies, it was an actual, it was a turn, right? We have these turns in academia where there's certain language becomes more popular. And I think diaspora, as like most people originally imagined it, comes from the Jewish diaspora, right? That was the initial one that most people found most comfortable recognizing. And so again, I think it's just, as when Nassar started the talk, was really about how the term has been in fashion. But of course, migration is a reality of the world. Resources are part of the world. There's so many reasons why people migrate, and there's so many different turns in even that study as well. So I guess it's more so how committed are you to using your term? What read, again, going back to the word of reading, what reads for your, how you want to talk about it? And what body of work seems quite referential to what you're talking about? I like the term. That's my
simply put, one doesn't have to be a migrant to be a member of a diaspora community. Sorry.
So I guess I think about it in terms of migrating and migration implying a sense of arriving, diaspora not so much, which I think probably just ties in what you said.
And also, I think there are institutional implications, especially when you address it to social policy. So when you're talking about migration policy, when you're talking about displacement of people in the world, migration is very different to diaspora, especially on the roots or the colonial roots that we are addressing in how the diaspora came about. I would never say Black Africans migrated into Brazil, right? So that is just a big difference that I think you need to be more aware when you are using the words and just, Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Well, on that point, please join me in thanking the organisers, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, the Stuart Hall Foundation, the RaceEd Network at the University of Edinburgh, alongside our three wonderful speakers this afternoon. And a reminder just to keep your eye on the Curious programme and to check out the next events on your way out. Thank you so much, everybody. Good afternoon.